Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Lumina Foundation's annual release of A Stronger Nation. I'm Courtney Brown, Vice President of Strategic Impact and Planning at Lumina, and we appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. This annual release is always a moment to take stock of where the country stands, but this year feels especially important. That's because last spring, Lumina set a new national goal, one that builds on everything we've learned over the past 2 decades about education, opportunity, and economic mobility. Nationally, we're now aiming for 75% of adults who are working, seeking work, or serving in the armed forces to have a college degree or other credential with value by 2040. And that phrase, credential with value, is central to this goal. For us, value has a very specific meaning. We're measuring whether formal education or training leads to earnings that are at least 15% higher than what a high school graduate earns. Keep that in mind, 15%. That benchmark gives us a clear, consistent way to understand whether education is actually paying off for people. And that focus on value comes directly from what people tell us they want. The Lumina Gallup research is clear. When Americans think about education and training, they're not just thinking about people getting into college or finishing. They're thinking about results, better jobs, higher wages, real economic opportunity. So today's Stronger Nation data is especially important because it gives us our starting point. Using that 15% earnings benchmark, 43.6% of adults nationally have a credential with economic value today. That's our baseline as we begin the work toward 2040. Now, setting a goal like this also means being clear about what it will take to reach it. Getting to 75% of the labor force doesn't happen by focusing on value alone. It means a larger share of the U.S. population will need to earn degrees and short-term credentials, like college certificates and industry certifications. In other words, educational attainment is still a critical part of this goal. You can't have more people with credentials of value if people aren't earning these credentials in the first place. And with that established, let's get into the data and what it's telling us about where the country stands today and where we may be headed. To help us make sense of what the data are telling us, we're fortunate to have a special guest with us today. If you've ever watched election night coverage and suddenly found yourself understanding what was happening on the map, you'll understand why we invited Steve Kornacki to join us and help tell the story. No one is better at looking at complex data, spotting patterns, and turning numbers into a story that makes sense. And that's exactly what we want him to do with A Stronger Nation today. So let's go out to New York and start with the basics. Steve, when you look at the attainment data over time, what stands out to you?
The story is one of steady progress. So remember, the goal was set for attainment back in 2009. You can see that right here, the starting point. Back then, fewer than 40% of all adults had some kind of post-high school credential. And you can see where things ended up landing here in 2025. That's 54.8%, clear majority there of all adults with that attainment goal being met. And again, I say that's all adults. That's 25 to 64. The other part of this story is age here, 25 to 34. That's the youngest group of adults. The number's even higher. So that speaks to continued, maybe accelerating progress. It is 56.3% at that attainment level for the youngest adults right now.
Thanks, Steve. That's great to see that progress we're making. So now we know it wouldn't be a Steve Kornacki presentation without a map. So let's look at the map now. What are you seeing by state?
Yeah, there's variation here by state. Surprise, surprise, right? So remember, the original goal that was set on attainment was 60% here. And there are a bunch of states that have hit that threshold here. So you can see Colorado and Utah, well over 60%, both of those states. Massachusetts, Vermont, they're over 60. Minnesota's over 60. D.C., it's not a state, but it's close enough for our purposes. Look at that, 73% attainment in D.C. And Puerto Rico, 60% there. Also a couple states, hey, we believe in math. We believe in what? Rounding up, 59.9%. That rounds to 60, so we're going to give Washington credit for this one. We're going to do the same thing for Virginia and New Hampshire. And then North Dakota, 59.4%. If you could have got that up 0.1%, we'd round it to 60. You'd join the 60% club, but we'll give you an honorable mention. And then again, remember, we're talking about all adults here. We're talking about also younger adults, 25 to 34 years old, there are some states that have hit 60% just in that group. We're talking here about Illinois, Wisconsin, New York, and Rhode Island. So these are the top performing states. But let's take a look here again at this goal, big picture. Where have we seen the most overall progress? And that's what you're looking at right here. These states here, these increases you're seeing are not percentage point increases. This is just how much these states have grown from baseline when it comes to attainment. West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Puerto Rico. Again, not a state close enough for our purposes. You've had the most overall progress over the span of this, the lifetime of this goal in these places.
Thanks, Steve. That's great foundation. But now let's shift gears. So we've talked about attainment, and that matters. But this year, we've also established something new, our baseline for credentials of value. Nationally, we're starting at 43.6%. So when you put that on the map and you look across the states, what stands out to you?
Yeah, well, everyone's got a lot of work to do. Certainly, that's why you set a goal, that goal of 75%. But a couple states are starting closer to that goal than the others. We're talking here about Colorado. Look at that, 51.7%. Massachusetts, D.C., these three places already over 50% in terms of hitting that value threshold. Hey, we'll put Washington in that category too, 49.8. We'll round that up to 50%. So they start out with maybe a head start here. Meanwhile, the most work needing to be done, you can see here in Nevada, in West Virginia, and in Mississippi. Another interesting story emerges when you look at this state data. A couple of imbalances here. So again, talking about, look at Puerto Rico, only 25% hitting the value threshold in Puerto Rico. If you remember a minute ago, we showed you attainment is through the roof in Puerto Rico. A lot of this has to do with the cost of living being so different in Puerto Rico versus the mainland. And an interesting story, I think, here in Indiana, you see 43.8% right now hitting that value threshold. That's a little bit above the national average. Indiana is below the national average on attainment. So the work being done in the Hoosier state specifically on value, you can see it paying off already here.
Thanks, Steve. So let's go one layer deeper. When you break the credentials of value down by type, some important patterns emerge. What do you see?
So I think this is interesting. We're taking a look at the different attainment levels here, and we're looking at the share within each group that are earning at least 15% over what the average is for a high school degree here. And some differences emerge. Obviously, look, associate degrees and these certifications, a majority who have those are hitting that 15% value threshold here, 54, 55%. But then look at the gap. Look at the jump, really, to a bachelor's degree or to an advanced degree, 70, 80% right there, hitting that value threshold. So what you're really seeing is those bachelor's degrees, a lot of people are saying, you know, what are they worth these days? You're seeing them pay off. You're certainly seeing those graduate degrees pay off from the standpoint of value already right here. And I think you're seeing work needing to be done when it comes to associate degrees and those certifications to try to match that.
So Steve, before we wrap up this part of the conversation, I want to zoom out one last time. After looking at attainment, value, and how uneven this is across states and credentials, what's the big takeaway you'd want this audience to leave with?
All right, let's zoom out a bit here because I think it's important to put that 75% value goal in some perspective. Why? I mean, look, you're at 43.6% nationally right now. Long way to go to get to 75%. The encouraging thing to keep in mind, though, is think of what happened with attainment. When that attainment goal was set back in 2009, you know how many states were even at 50% attainment? The answer is 0. You know how many are today? The answer is 41. That's the progress that's been seen on attainment. And a lot of those states we showed you well over 50%, and the ones that are under are barely under 50%. So you've seen massive growth when it comes to attainment over the lifetime of that goal. If you sort of say the same thing is going to happen here, you could see pretty steady growth happening in the next decade, decade and a half when it comes to value.
Wow, Steve. Thanks so much for making the data come alive for us today. I know you're about to sprint straight from Stronger Nation to the Super Bowl, so I appreciate you fitting us in before kickoff. Safe travels and have a great time. And now I'm excited to bring Jeff Stroll into the conversation. Jeff is the director of the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce, where he and his colleagues have been researching and reporting on education, value, and the labor market for years. He helps us connect data to the value goal by looking at how education translates into real economic opportunity, workforce needs, and long-term growth. So today, Jeff's going to help us respond to many of the questions we hear about our new goal and what credentials of value really mean for people, communities, and the nation. Following my conversation with Jeff, we're going to open it up to your questions. So feel free to post questions along the way in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. So Jeff, thanks for unpacking some of this for me, and I'm going to ask you some questions, as I said, that we get often. One of the questions that we get is about attainment. And the goal that we've, clearly, as we just saw from the data, made incredible progress on the national goal to increase attainment. And people say, so what? So what that attainment has increased? So looking at it from an economic standpoint, what has the increase in attainment done for the country?
Well, if we look, Courtney, over the last decade or so, I think we had about 7-8 percentage point increase in attainment. And that attainment is projected across the life cycle of the individuals to bring about $14.2 trillion in gains to the U.S. economy. So we have both the economic side of the house, which is really, wages are linked with productivity. So it's really enhancing the strength and vitality of the economy and impacting people's well-being.
So let me just pause for a second, because you said $14.3 trillion, and I think that often gets ignored, or people don't actually hear that. That's $14.3 trillion just from that increase in attainment.
Yeah, so if we're looking at the attainment across that 10-year period across the life cycle of these individuals, so if we add up their earnings and some of the non-pecuniary benefits, health and others, it adds up to 14.2 trillion.
Yeah, amazing. And really speaks to why economic prosperity is so important, and so important about increasing credentials, because it will increase economic prosperity for individuals and for the country. Another thing that we hear a lot is about skills-based training, skills. And you make a distinction between general and specific skills. Can you help me understand what you mean by that and what it means for this?
Sure. What we really mean by general education or general skills is the ability to understand the rule structure of an existing task and transfer it to other activities. And the U.S. economy is based very uniquely, when we compare it to other countries, on a mix of specific and general education. So that specific component of the education is really what's necessary to do task A. The general education adds or combines with that specific skill to help imbue flexibility in the U.S. economy. So if you compare ourselves to many other economies, that unique mix is what I call it. It's the secret sauce of American economic vitality, because first it enables us to do the immediate task, but then be resilient in the face of change, with changing technologies, changing work processes, economic shocks, and the like. So it really helps us maintain our economic agility.
Excellent. So let me put that in more context. So we also hear a lot of skepticism about the liberal arts degree. And people say, well, is it valuable? Is it worth it? What would you say about the liberal arts degree? And how do you think about that when you talk about general skills, general education?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I was talking to David Leonhardt, a journalist at the New York Times, and he said, why do people just always insist on comparing the liberal arts and more broadly the humanities to the highest paying majors in the U.S. economy, like petroleum engineering? It's not really a meaningful comparison. You're always going to have a top of the heap. But if you look at the humanities and the liberal arts, they fall very nicely in the middle of the BA wage distribution, meaning that people who go out and get these degrees commonly do quite well when we think about economic opportunity and mobility. So the liberal arts in this frame, there's a great paper by a guy named Theodore Schultz he did in 1975 called The Value of the Ability to Deal with These Equilibria. And often economists say that the economy is always in equilibrium, where in fact you and I both know stuff happens every day and we have to move with the punches. Well, the liberal arts enable us both to think in a combination of cognitive and non-cognitive skills to think our way through new problems as they happen. So that general basis that we get in the liberal arts and the humanities really helps, I think, the workers and our workforce, again, with this idea of being very flexible or agile in the face of changes.
So to break it down, the liberal arts degree are valuable to both to individuals and our economy.
Absolutely. I often think about American history majors. People say, well, you know, there are not many historian jobs, but if you actually look at the data, American history majors are the highest paid of the humanities in the U.S. economy, and there's not many historian jobs. So they're actually able to use that broad base of knowledge about history and culture and politics and apply it across a wide variety of occupations and jobs.
Excellent. So let me bring it now up a little bit to the BA. And, you know, you, me, everybody has read the news about the confidence in the bachelor's degree dropping, and Americans are having less confidence in college. So when you think about the BA and the skepticism some people are feeling about it, how does that fit into this conversation?
People have, you know, it's been a hard path for the BA, being faced with rising debt, et cetera. But if you look at the data, BAs on average, the median BA does quite well, pays off debt, and, you know, need to look later out in the life cycle. And you see that the BA really begins to flourish after about age 35. Debts are paid off, and the rest of that is profit in the life cycle. So the BA does well. Of course, there's going to be BAs that don't work, just like any other type of degree. But as an average or better than average bet for someone, they pay off.
Yeah. And you know, based on the data that Steve had just shown us, 70% of the BAs make at least that 15% premium, and most of those make well over that 15% premium. So the other piece that, you know, using that same data that Steve pointed out to us were those short-term credentials, the certifications, the associate degrees. And we saw from that data that, you know, only about half of those people are realizing that 15% premium. Can you speak a little bit to the variability that we're seeing in some of those short-term credentials, especially the certification?
Sure. I mean, one of the characteristics of these short-term, what we call non-degree credentials, is they're often very vocational or specific in nature. So they got to be really laser beam aligned with the job in the field that somebody's going to work on. We don't have the strongest counseling system in the world, and we need to invest more in it to help these students align with jobs that they make use of their skills by themselves in our existing system. As you pointed out, 50% or more don't land in a job that helps bring family sustaining earnings. So we need to hone a little bit more on helping. And this is one reason I really like that Lumina has been attaching a value metric on with their attainment goal to help us sort the wheat from the chaff and give good information to students. Secondly, which is something for us to think about in the future, is a lot of the work that we've been doing with certificates and certifications suggests that people are using them on top of their degree in many ways to help supercharge their degree along the life cycle for career advancement and other pieces. And I think eventually we need to start also looking at how people are using them in conjunction with their degrees.
Yeah, probably a really important way for upskilling, reskilling in today's economy. And thinking about the need to upskill and reskill, no conversation would be complete without the elephant in the room, and that's AI. Everybody's talking about AI. Again, also in the news, you know, reading about millions of jobs are going to be lost because of AI. From, you know, what you're seeing in the research and, you know, just historically, what should we be thinking about AI and how that's going to impact the future of credentials?
It's a little hard to figure our way through this mess at the moment because there's so much noise, there's so much impact that's a result of investment shifts by the major firms. So we really don't know yet how AI is going to directly impact jobs themselves. The suspicion that I have based on what happened with automation, what happened with offshoring, is that it's going to force us to think about occupations as portfolio of tasks. And I really believe that AI is not going to destroy occupations, you know, torched earth type of like we hear often in the news, but it's going to morph occupations in a way that they change. And this is really where, back to the liberal arts and many of the other fields, is having a base knowledge to treat AI as a tool so that you're able to do one task a little easier, but still have the base knowledge of where to use it and how to use it. But it's still a bit unclear how AI is going to be affecting the market.
But definitely we'll continue to need those BAs, that further knowledge after high school, you believe, in an AI world.
Absolutely. I think that understanding how to use the tool, I used to be in carpentry. If you don't know how to use a hammer, you're not going to sink the nail. If you don't know accounting, you're not going to know how to use AI in accounting framework or economics or any other piece. And especially as you get into things that you touch other people. Right, and so AI is just always going to miss that human touch, but I think it's going to carry across many other areas. You need the base knowledge.
Excellent. So I'm going to ask Jeff one more question, and then I'm going to come to your question. So make sure you're putting them in that Q&A box. So Jeff, you spend a lot of time in data, and data can sometimes be exhausting and sometimes not that uplifting. So what gives you hope when you look at the data, when you look at the research? What gives you hope about the future of education in the workforce?
Well, coming at it from the data perspective, we have been in a period of time where data has, the continuity is a little bit scary, but for data that we work with, commonly Census American Community Survey data, it's been fairly consistent, and we have pretty good hope that it will continue. Even without having the threats to data that we've been seeing as of late, I think that more reliance on state-based data is going to be extremely important, and especially if we think about Stronger Nation, where I want, and I think Lumina wants, the states to own the data and own the attainment goals, and they have the best data in the world for these issues. So I'm quite hopeful with that, that it'll continue.
Yeah, states have always been incredible partners, so
Yes.
I think that also gives me great hope with our state partners. So, as I said, now it's time to hear from you, our viewers. So thanks for putting lots of interesting questions in the Q&A box, and keep them coming. So my colleague Chris Mullen is behind the scenes keeping track of all your questions, and he's sending them my way. So I'm going to start with our first question. Debbie asks, and you just spoke to some of this, but how have changes in the federal data availability impacted Stronger Nation?
From what I know, I don't think they've really impacted Stronger Nation that much, because back to the continuity of the American Community Survey, which I believe is your root foundation. So I think things are going to be fine, and hopefully continue to be fine with those data. As we start to look with more education-oriented research, there are some threats to longitudinal data series that are going to make it perhaps a little more difficult for some of the future plans on looking at mobility. But I think when it comes to Stronger Nation, that the data should be pretty secure.
Yeah, I agree. As long as we can continue to have that American Community Survey data and increase, response rates, we make sure we're getting a great representative sample, then at this moment we feel okay. Let's get to our next question. So Carlos asks, this is actually a good question. How much does a high school graduate make? So when we look at our new goal is about economic prosperity, and we're measuring that by that 15% premium over high school alone. And so that number is updated every year. And so the current number for the 2024 data, which is what we're using, is just under $46,000 is what a high school graduate makes. That's the national average. And just keep in mind, that's an average from the 25 to 64-year-old. So that's not what someone is making right out of high school. It's the average of all those people. But that's the benchmark that we're using, that for the 2024 data, it's just under $46,000. Thanks for that question, Carlos. All right, Barry asks, can you explain the difference between the attainment number and the credential of value number? So the 54.8% is attainment, and the 43.6% number is the credential of value number. So I'll start out, and then Jeff, feel free to jump in. So Lumina, starting in 2009, had set a 2025 goal, that by 2025, 60% of Americans would have a degree or credential of value. And so Lumina and the nation and all of our state partners have been working on that goal for the last 15 years. And where we stand today is 54.8% of Americans have a degree or a short-term credential of value, which is great. We've made incredible progress on that, as Steve showed in some of the data. Given what we're hearing from people and the concerns about degrees and credentials, we wanted to make sure that they're delivering value, that people that are receiving these are getting a good job and having a good life. And so listening to some of these concerns and speaking to our partners is when last year Lumina set this new goal, 75% by 2040, meaning 75% of people in the labor market would have a degree, or short-term credential that leads to economic prosperity. The new number that you just pointed out, that 43.6%, is our baseline for where we're starting on that goal, the credential of value goal. And we're working by 2040 to 75%. But 43.6% represents our baseline for that. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think it's just a little bit outside of Lumina's bailiwick, but I think as states and other people move forward is really understanding how people move through the labor market. So many of the young workers, and I believe there was some data on this earlier about having higher levels of attainment, is our young workers move in towards the peak of their career into 30, 35. And so while your range is 25 to 64, as we move forward, it's going to be really important to keep our eye on that early part of the market, for maybe first 10 years of the career, where we know many of those workers are going to really have lots of accelerated gain getting into the portions of economic mobility. And I think this is, again, is a great reason, a reason why with Lumina having attached value to its goals.
Yeah, and speaking about the age groups, just to let everybody know, in Stronger Nation, you can actually look at a breakdown of age groups for the credentials of value and for attainment. So.
Great.
Excellent. All right, next question. So Pat asks, what would you recommend my child major in? Pat, great question. And those of us who have kids currently in college or have finished college, it's a question that you sit around at the kitchen table and ask all the time. At Lumina and in Stronger Nation, we do not choose majors or areas of study and say these are more valuable than others because, as we were talking about states, it really depends. It depends on the labor market in your region, in your community, in the state, on which credentials provide value to an individual and which do not. So we do not do that, but communities should be looking at that. What is their labor market demand? What is, states should be thinking about that. So they're delivering the types of credentials that their population needs. So it's back to states should use their data because they have the best data available for that. But at Stronger Nation and at Lumina at the national level, we will not pick majors or areas of study because it really depends on where you are in the country. Now, I know Georgetown has done some work on this and has some reports on different types of majors and what that means. So I would recommend you look into some of that research.
I was just going to say, I've got a son who just started college, and he didn't listen to me, so good luck.
So that generally happens. So feel free to keep adding questions. Again, Chris is behind the scenes, sharing some questions with us. So Holly asks, do you see a time when we'll be talking about a wider range of measure beyond earnings? Holly, I love this question and thinking about it. And Jeff spoke to it about, other things beyond earnings are important. And we agree with you. Part of the problem is back to the data issue. We don't have data on, debt, cost, well-being, other things that we know that having a credential leads to, some of these other impacts that on your life beyond financial. But at this point, what we have are earnings, and so that's what we're going to use because it's our best available data.
Just one point here. Americans demand that education do everything, including unclog the sink, and so not all of them are measurable. So just think about it. Would you get rid of the football team, the band, things like that? So we have part of the experiences in going to college. Very difficult to measure the satisfaction you get from the education process. Very difficult to understand how you can measure the well-being, although we do have many surveys that help us understand that.
Yeah. I mean, research has shown again and again, not only the economic impact on the individual, but also, they're more likely to be healthy, they're more likely to vote, they're more likely to participate in their communities, so volunteer, donate money and other resources. And so we do see all these other impacts, but from a national level, also being able to disaggregate by state, we just don't have that level of data.
That's right.
Related to that, we have a question about, is there any consideration being given to geographic pay differentials when looking at the financial threshold of the new metric? So we, when we were thinking about this new goal and speaking to partners around the nation, because this is a national goal and it's the nation's goal, we talked a lot about this, whether we should compare to a national high school or whether we should compare to each state. And given that we have a national goal, we decided that we should focus on a national comparison. But again, we encourage states to think about, when they're setting their own goals, think about what that means for your area and perhaps use a comparison to your own state.
I agree with that, absolutely. This is really up to the states to decide on the metric, because there's a bunch of different ways to adjust for geographic cost of living. And I just think for your work with A Stronger Nation, it would have been impossible to pick up every community, every rural area, every metro area, but the tools, the states have them.
Excellent, thank you. And we have time for one more question, and that question is, what do you think states can do with this information? So again, a great question. We've been talking about, state data systems are so important. One of the things when we had the attainment goal, the 2025 goal, is when that goal was first set for the nation, only one state had a goal that was focused on attainment. And over the course of 15 years, 48 additional states, so 49 total states, set their own attainment goals. And we saw attainment, go nationally from 39% to almost 55%, which is a tremendous gain. And it was really the work of those states, not just setting goals, but putting practices and policies behind those goals that allowed their populations to increase in attainment. So that's one thing. Jeff, any other thing that you would add?
Yeah, I think one of the services Lumina has done with their goal setting is they basically have set a lighthouse off in the distance to give us guidance where to go to. But the states are the ones who are piloting the ship to get there. So state data is going to be extremely important to measure progress, to understand points of impact, and where actionable policy can be implemented, as long as they have a belief and understanding that getting towards that lighthouse and being navigated through the fog is going to have a lot of benefit for the economy and the individuals in your states.
All right, so Robert just snuck in a last question, so I'm going to ask it to you, Jeff. So Robert says, we keep hearing college isn't worth it. Is that true? Jeff?
Oh, boy, we never get away from that one, do we? On average, college is worth it, and there's a lot of reasons to drive variance, but overall, a BA is going to give a positive return on investment. So if we look into the data across earnings and unemployment and other factors, especially economic mobility, it pays off, and it is worth it. Of course, there's some that are not. But I think on average, it's well worth the investment.
And I would just say that this goal is, really helping us to work on those that maybe aren't worth it. We're setting this goal by, 2040 so that we can start addressing and thinking about what isn't worth it and increasing value so that all people have credentials of value. So excellent. With that, we have run out of time for questions. Thank you so much for the great questions. So we appreciate the energy, the curiosity you brought to the conversation. And before I let you go, though, I want to encourage everyone to spend some time with the Stronger Nation site if you haven't already. Or if you have, come back and explore it more deeply. This new release is packed with insights, and the site is designed to help you see the data in ways that matter for your work. So let me walk you through a few highlights on the site while you're seeing them on the screen. So what you're looking at now is the opening page. This sets the context and gives you the big picture of where the nation stands today toward our new goal of 75% by 2040. Next, as you move down the page, you move into the credentials section. This view lets you see how different credentials stack up on value. For example, as Steve showed, you can see here about 70% of bachelor's degrees meet or exceed the 15% earnings premium. These data help ground the conversation about value within a credential type. Now, if you want to look at any state, use the drop-down menu and choose the state of your choice. So let's take a look at Indiana here. Here you can see specific data for Indiana, including where they stand with credentials of value, how the data break down by type of credential, and by population demographics. And finally, while our new goal is focused on credentials of value, we will also continue to track attainment data for the nation and for each state. This remains a core part of Stronger Nation, and we're going to keep tracking and reporting on it because it's a necessary component toward building opportunity, strengthening the workforce, and supporting long-term economic growth. I also want to take a moment to say thank you to a few people who made today possible. First, thank you to Steve for fitting us in before the Super Bowl and for bringing the data to life in a way that was clear, engaging, and honestly pretty fun to follow. Safe travels, Steve, and enjoy the analysis, the predictions, and hopefully the game. A big thank you to Jeff for his insights, for tackling some of our toughest questions about value. Jeff made the data make sense, and he kept it interesting, which I know we all appreciate. And a very special thank you to Chris Mullen, who keeps all the many pieces of Stronger Nation moving behind the scenes. This work does not happen without his steady leadership and coordination. And to everyone who joined us today, thank you for the thoughtful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I do want to encourage you to check out the methodology section on Stronger Nation, along with those FAQs. They go deep. They'll likely answer many of your questions that you were already thinking about. At the end of the day, this data is not just about numbers or charts. It's about people. It's about using what we know to make better decisions in policy and in practice so more people can access education and training that actually works for them. Stronger Nation is a tool to help us ask better questions, make smarter choices. We hope you'll take this data into your own work and use it to inform the policies you influence, the programs you design, and the partnerships you build. When more people can access and succeed in earning credentials of value, communities benefit, the economy grows, and more people are on a path to a good job and a good life. Thank you for being part of this conversation. And thanks for the work you do every day to expand opportunity and drive real change.